Good morning, everyone. Yeah, okay. Good morning, everyone. So just to continue the look at the relationship between Peshat and Midrash, in very brief, to summarize what we've said so far, we've seen that Rashi's vision of being the Baal HaPshat is that he generally chooses between Midrashim, or in the absence of a Midrash, will explain Peshat, but sees Peshat, when Rashi keeps on insisting that I'm explaining Peshuto, Shel, Mikra, the simplest understanding, by that Rashi means I'm choosing the Midrash, I'm choosing the Midrash which best explains the Peshuto, Shel, Mikra, but by and large, not thinking that Peshat means an alternative to the drashas or the reading of Chazal, but simply a way of determining which Chazal is closest to Peshat. Rashi's grandson, the Rashbam, the Ibn Ezra, choose Peshatim which differ with Chazal and think that there is value and legitimacy in reading Passukim on a Peshat level, even though their reading contradicts Chazal's version of a story or even Chazal's understanding of a halacha. And nonetheless, there's value to this. The Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam are both halachic Jews, it doesn't need to be said. The Ibn Ezra, in fact, wages war against the Karaim. The Rashbam doesn't discuss Karaim. There apparently are no significant or no significant number of Karaim in Europe at the time. They're based in Egypt and the Spanish-speaking and the Arabic-speaking world. The Ibn Ezra is committed to halacha. The Rashbam is obviously committed to halacha, one of the most important mefarshim on the Talmud, on the Talmud Bavli, on the Gemara. But nonetheless, they see value in saying Peshatim, which are against Chazal's understanding of the story, or even against halacha. And they somehow understand that we have this multi-layered Torah, in which there's value in reading it in Peshuto Shel Mikra, even though when it comes to practical halacha, again and again, the Rashbam says, we follow the drashas of Chazal. And what we're exploring is they don't explain specifically what their philosophy is behind this, how they understand this. To the best of my knowledge, the Ibn Ezra really says very little about this. He rigorously attacks the Karaim who go against the drashas of Chazal to Paskin, but he doesn't exactly explain what he sees as the purpose of saying Peshuto Shel Mikra. The Rashbam does a little bit more. The Rashbam famously says that his grandfather admitted to him that had he more time, he would write another parish or turn to parish, another parish, which was yet more Peshat based. The Rashbam speaks about the chedushim in Peshat that he's constantly coming up with. And yet he again and again stresses in his words, in his language, don't desert my grandfather Rashi's parish, don't leave it. There's the halacha follows the drashas of Chazal. So Rashbam does speak about his philosophy a little bit. Again, doesn't really explain what he's doing in Peshuto Shel Mikra. What I wanted to do was share another couple of examples of how radically different Pshats can be from the Midrash, and then try and take examples where we have some insight into how this multi-layered approach can work. In other words, what's the point of understanding both the Midrash and Peshat if the Peshat is against halacha? And we're going to try and explore examples of how this multi-tiers approached. The first example that we looked at last time was the story of Nimrod, which Chazal understand that Nimrod is a Rasha, not just any Rasha, a terrible Rasha. And the Ibn Ezra takes the Peshuto Shel Mikra and argues that the simple meaning of being a hunter, Lifnei Hashem, is that of a tzaddik. The language of Pashukim is v'kush yolad is Nimrod, who heichal lios gibor ba'aretz. So gibor tzayid Lifnei Hashem. He was a mighty gibor, a mighty person in front of Hashem. Ibn Ezra says that this demonstrates a greatness also. The Ramban says that Ibn Ezra is matstik a rasha. He's making a wicked person out to be a tzaddik. What's the point of that? Says the Ramban. Interestingly, the Ramban doesn't argue that this is a reasonable reading of the Pasuk if all we had was the Pasuk. He says Chazal evidently had a tradition that Nimrod was a rasha, so let's not play with that. What does the Ibn Ezra think he was doing? If Chazal had such a tradition, he knows they said he was a rasha. We don't know. He doesn't really explain to us his philosophy. Maybe he's arguing that Nimrod can be understood on multiple levels. It's perfectly possible for someone to have great great aspects to their personality. For Nimrod to be someone who, in some respects, is a gibor lifnei Hashem, and yet at the same time to be a terrible Rasha. Life is complicated. People can exist on multiple levels, and maybe the Ibn Ezra therefore thinks there's value in reading it on two levels. We don't know. He doesn't tell us. The problem, by the way, with this theory is we don't know how far to take it, and how radical the Ibn Ezra might have been willing to be. In a moment, we'll see an example, perhaps, where the Ibn Ezra thinks a contemporary of his, a great contemporary of his, the Rashbam, went too far. It's very difficult to know what are the parameters. When would the Ibn Ezra agree that you can step out of Chazal's understanding for the purposes of Peshat, and when wouldn't he agree? And I'll just mention one comment around this. It's a thought that occurred to me. It's not a fully fleshed out thought. It's just an idea. The Ibn Ezra famously and very controversially seems to have expanded the sections of the Torah about which he is open to considering them as not having been written directly by Moshe. And I just want to explain this matter because it's a very, very sensitive matter, a very controversial matter, and something that needs to be explored a little bit. Chazal looked at the last 8 Passukim of the Torah, in which Moshe describes his own death. And they say, how could Moshe have written this? In what way did Moshe write this? And they give several answers. In one answer, they say, look, Moshe is a prophet, a Navi, and therefore, even though these Passukim are written as if they're describing that which has occurred, they're written prophetically in some form or other. Maybe Moshe writes them whilst crying, maybe the text is written in some proto-Torah form and then extrapolated after he dies, but on some level or other, the text exists and is brought into the world by Moshe Rabbeinu. Chazal bring an alternative in which Yehoshua wrote the text. So there's 8 Passukim in the Torah not written by Moshe, but written by Yehoshua. Now the Rambam establishes as an Ikar, as a principle of faith, that the whole Torah is written by Moshe. I spoke about this on Wednesday in my Parshanut, but basically there's 3 Ikrim which are connected to this matter. Ikr number 6 is the idea of prophecy. Ikr number 7 is the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy, which comes out from last week's Ezra, which is why I spoke about it, where Miriam is informed by Hashem. Moshe is a completely different type of prophet. And Ikr number 8 is Torah's Moshe, the idea that the whole Torah came via Moshe, who as the Navi, who directly hears word for word from Hashem, is the only Navi qualified to write a Torah dictated by Hashem. Now, the Rambam, as I said, says that every word of the Torah comes from Moshe. What would he make of this idea that Yehoshua wrote the last 8 Passukim? So either he's not paskening like that, he thinks even the last 8 Passukim came from Moshe himself directly, or whether he paskens like that or not, he doesn't consider taking 8 Passukim, which are explicitly mentioned by the Gemara, as heretical to say those 8 Passukim came from Yeshua and are somehow different. The truth is the Rambam speaks about this in his Mishnah Torah, because there are perhaps halachic implications to the altered nature of the last 8 Passukim, and we're not going to go into that for now. But the Rambam seems open to the idea that at least 8 Passukim are written by Yeshua, and perhaps for these 8 Passukim, Yeshua has clarity of revelation equivalent to Moshe, such that this can also be Torah's Moshe. What are we meant to make of the idea that the Ibn Ezra says that perhaps there are other Passukim in the Torah also written by a later Navi? Now, there's a number of points to make. First of all, this is not some form of proto-biblical criticism or the like, because the Ibn Ezra is not Chas v'Shalom suggesting that this is a later insertion, a later text that somehow pulls in, that these are sort of multiple authors, etc. He says the Torah is a single author. The single author of the Torah is from Hashem. But he believes that it's legitimate to say that there's a pasuk here or there, which for whatever reason was added in by a later Navi, as per the last 8 Passukim. So it would appear to be the view of the Ibn Ezra. Now, this is controversial on a number of levels for obvious reasons, because in and of in itself, does this contradict the Ikar of the Rambam, in that there could be other Nevi'im? The Rambam says only Moshe wrote it, but even the Rambam maybe doesn't see as heresy to say 8 Passukim are, so maybe you could agree that there's a handful of other Passukim which also came from later Nevi'im. Maybe the main point of the Rambam is don't think that the Torah is like other works, don't think it's like a work written by other Nevi'im, in which things are in which a Navi is choosing their own words. But if here and there a Navi has 1 or 2 words, 1 or 2 Passukim in which they could put in for whatever reason, written with great clarity, maybe that's less of an issue. again, what point in history are we talking about being added? Maybe we're just talking about Yeshua doing later extrapolations. So the Ibn Ezra is difficult as to whether it technically fits this Ikar of the Rambam. But it's not a full-scale, God forbid, rejection of the Ikar of the Rambam. It's only saying that it's possible that there's a small sections here or there which came from a later Novi. So apparently, possibly, the Ibn Ezra believed. The reason why I keep on saying apparently he believed or possibly he believed is because there's a second issue here in which the Ibn Ezra really only hints at his views. He doesn't say them explicitly, and therefore, at the end of the day, they're open to interpretation. It would appear, and there seems to be a reasonable understanding, that this is what the Ibn Ezra meant. I can show you various sources for those who are interested in this. I can't point you to a place where he says this explicitly, but so it appears to be his understanding. Yeah.
We've got John Ludinsky to this very day by Zach from Good.
Yes. That is correct. So he wrote a book on this matter and various other things. I also, for those interested, have many hours of recording many years ago. And now, soon after I joined, I spoke about this matter. I spoke just before the book came out. And after it came out, I saw it, and there's a fair amount of overlap, but there's quite a bit of additional material in my speak about also. But absolutely, there's a good Torah book on the subject. Well, someone who has no agenda or anything like that, but there's a Talmud Chacham attempting to explore it very nicely. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. So again, I don't know the source. The truth is, when I spoke about it, I was a little uncomfortable speaking about it because if Ibn Ezra concealed his intention because he recognized it was a dangerous idea, who am I to speak about it? But since then, as I said, it's the time it was spoken about by academics and the like is now much more out there. We live in, for better or for worse, in a sort of information-free age. And as I said, Ibn Ezra is not. The Ibn Ezra was a Rishon, and he was entitled to tweak here or there Ikrim of the Rambam. And certainly on a fundamental level, the tweak is not particularly significant in the sense that he is saying a prophet wrote these, and seems to be open to the idea that other prophets, at least on occasion, could write words which here or there could enter into the Torah. But nonetheless, it definitely is if taken too far, it does open a can of worms because it leads one to ask, okay, how far can we take this? And that needs much further thought. But there's a reason why I'm mentioning this here in this context. But yeah, sorry. Yes, he did. So first of all, he says it's not just 8 Passukim. If we're going to take Chazal, then it's another 5 additional Passukim. Because even though it's only the last 8 Passukim that describe the death of Moshe, there's a 5 Passukim before that describe Moshe ascending the hill in order to die. And surely by that point, Moshe had already left the camp and therefore wasn't capable of writing the Torah. So he adds 5 more Passukim to this. And then here or there, he says, he takes Passukim which I'll tell you very briefly the headlines of the problem that Ibn Ezra is coming to resolve. And this is actually alluded to in the title of the book you just mentioned, Ad Hayom Hazeh. So here or there, the Torah says, Ad Hayom Hazeh, an event continued till this day. The question is, what does this day mean? Now, there's 2 alternatives you could give to the translation of Ad Hayom Hazeh, until this day. Either it's the Torah saying, until this day of any reader, possibly in the future. And there are places where that fits in the Torah. The Torah is saying this remained the case, Ad Hayom Hazeh, for eternity, till this day. Any reader who ever reads this will be Ad Hayom Hazeh. There are other alternatives, other cases, where Ad Hayom Hazeh would appear to be till the time this pasuk is written. It can't mean for all eternity. So, for example, there's a section of the Torah that speaks about the tax policy of Egypt, when Yotze confiscates the lands or the Egyptians hand over the lands to Pharaoh's ownership in return for food in the famine, and as a result they pay a certain tax to the Pharaoh, or rental of 20%. And the Pasuk says, Ad Hayom Hazeh, this remains in the possession of the Kohanim didn't take it, and so on. Now, this is not currently in line with Egyptian tax policy. I think people in Egypt would be very happy with the 20% tax on their agricultural land. So Ad Hayom Hazeh clearly doesn't mean for all eternity. In which case, it would mean until the time of the writing of Moshe. Now, in that case, the Ad Hayom Hazeh fits, meaning it makes sense till the time of Moshe, because Moshe is writing several hundred years after the Yosef story in Egypt, and therefore Ad Hayom Hazeh makes sense. There are other cases where the Ad Hayom Hazeh doesn't seem to fit neatly into either category. It's neither Ad Hayom Hazeh of eternity, nor does it make sense to say it's Ad Hayom Hazeh at the time of Moshe, because he's writing at the time. So who wrote this Ad Hayom Hazeh? And that's an example There's a pasuk, "V'hakanani oz ba'oret," the Canaanites were then in the land, talking about Avraham. In other words, there's a reader who's reading this and wondering, why is Avraham interacting with the Canaanim? The Canaanim are long gone. So V'hakanani oz ba'oret, they were in the land. If Moshe is writing it, the Canaanim are still in the land. So what's this turn of phrase? And the like. Now there are plenty of other answers to this question. None of these questions are knockout blows, but the Ibn Ezra certainly is open. There's other examples with the measurements of Og and his height and the size of his bed, and there's various examples where Ibn Ezra thinks that the language doesn't make sense unless you're open to the possibility that these were put in by a later Navi. Now, all I want to say on this is it's very difficult to know if the Ibn Ezra meant by this that this is the authentic reading of the Torah and the only reading of the Torah, and meant that this is on every level the legitimate reading, or if he's doing this in his role as a Baal HaPeshat, who believes that it's legitimate to talk about Peshat, even though this contrasts with Chazal's Midrashic understanding. In which case, the Ibn Ezra, in a sense, is saying something much more moderate. He's saying, I know that there are other explanations of these turn of phrase, because the Torah is written on the level of Remez and on the level of Medrash, and therefore there's other ways of understanding these difficult stories or texts in the Torah, in which the Torah says things which in Peshat don't seem to fit in with the time of the writing. However, on a Peshat level, this is it's reasonable to say this is something put in by a later Navi. And once Ibn Ezra is willing to say, I'm fiercely anti-Karaite, I think on halachic level, 100% have complete loyalty to Midrash Chazal. But in the Peshat, in Peshuto Shel Mikra, you can read the text as a more plain, simple text. Then all he might be saying is that on a Peshuto Shel Mikra, on a Peshat level, V'hakanani oz ba'oret must be a later text. On a Midrashic level, you can understand it in other ways. Rashi has a perfectly viable alternative explanation of V'hakanani oz ba'oret, which is Avraham is worrying about Canaanite ownership of Eretz Yisrael, but in truth, he shouldn't have to worry, because in genuine ownership, the land doesn't belong to them. They are thieves. It's Eretz Yisrael. It belongs to us. Rashi, right at the beginning of the Torah, tells us, now Hashem gives the land to whom he wants and takes it away from whom he wants. V'hakanani oz ba'oret means temporarily the Canaanites have possession of the land, and therefore Avraham is giving them respect for their property rights. But in truth, this is only temporary, it's not really theirs, it doesn't really belong to them. So in which case, we have almost a classic example of Peshat and Medrash working together. On a Peshat level, the Canaanites are in the land, they own the land. On a Midrashic level, if you really want to understand the sort of existential, spiritual relationship between the Canaanites, the Canaanim, and the land, no, they have no connection to the land. They are merely ad hoc, temporary, not even tenants, temporary squatters on the land. So again, the challenge here is as follows. What the Torah, I can't emphasize this enough, that the Torah is a very different sort of text to how regular texts work. And it depends what assumptions you make, which will determine whether you consider something to be reasonable or not. Maybe we should do an in-depth exploration of biblical criticism on this forum, because it needs a proper look at. But every question raised, to the best of my knowledge, raised by the biblical critics has been mentioned by Chazal. The problem, in inverted commas, is that Chazal simply give answers about answers that appear very strange if you think of the Torah as a regular text. So it's sort of circular. If the Torah is an unusual type of text in which layers of meaning exist in a manner which would be unusual for a human author to write, then none of these questions are problematic. If the text is how you would expect a regular book to be written, then the answers of Chazal are very difficult to understand. So what do we make of texts which list the genealogy of Binyamin and others to be radically different in later Sfarim in the Torah to the one that we're told about when they go down to the lands of Egypt? Rashi gives an answer to the question. He says that there's parts of Binyamin that were merged. There's parts of Shimon that were wiped out in the battles with the post Bilom affair. There's changes of names to indicate midrashic events that occur in their lives. Is that a normal way to write? Would you be surprised if you had two versions of your family tree in your history in which the family tree is just reflected something completely different. Well, it depends in which way they reflected something completely different. If one family tree said that your uncle was called Jack, and another family tree said he was called Yankel, and a third family tree said he was called Yaakov, you would understand that these are referring to the same individual. If they're completely different, in one family tree Jack has 7 children, in another family tree he only has 1, you would be a little puzzled. Unless there's a story there in which he disowned 6 of his children because he fell out with them and something happened. So what's the nature of what's considered contradictory or not depends on how you expect a text to work and how much information you would. We read a text and we expect it to be pretty self-explanatory, and we're bothered by the idea that there's a whole battle that takes place, or a whole wiping out of families, or a whole change in seniority in the family lineage that Torah doesn't bother mentioning other than by one word change in the family tree. So the Ibn Ezra seems to be saying, in Peshat, these are legitimate questions, but in Midrash, they're not legitimate questions, and there's value to reading the Torah both ways. And as I say, we're sort of struggling to know what that means and why it should work on multiple levels. So we saw examples of this, and we'll see more examples of this, where Rishonim explicitly address this sort of conundrum of dual meaning, and we haven't yet got to this. We're going to see the Safana on this, we're going to see the Rambam on this, in which they almost explicitly address two meanings, and they're happy to see the Pshat telling us one dimension of existence, in which Nimrod has something, according to Ibn Ezra, very righteous about him, and the Midrash telling us something else, which is, yeah, but you should know, overall, Sachar Kol, in totality, this guy's an absolute rotter. And there's no contradiction between these two texts. So even with the famously controversial views of the Ibn Ezra around Vakanani Osba'aretz and this book, which explores are there versions of kosher biblical Kissim, if you're not biblical Kissim, God forbid, but versions of reconsidering how the texts were put together. The Ibn Ezra may well have only meant this on Peshuto Shel Mikra. He's on Peshat. I have a way of making this a more normal text. On Midrash, I understand there's other layers and dimensions of existence, and the Midrashic readings also have significance. The basic difficulty is, as I said, that the Gemara and the Rishonim, the early Rishonim, didn't really speak. They didn't tell us that there's sort of metacognition going on. They just told us how they were reading things, and they didn't step back and give us a sort of systematic philosophy of what they meant by these ideas and how they put these together, because they dealt with things differently. Chazal didn't really speak philosophy. They used metaphor and medrash and poetry and stories to convey philosophical ideas. They didn't sort of step back and there's many reasons for philosophy being a removed way. In philosophy, you sort of step back and analyze something. There's something more organic about it. Again, I mean, the current example we have of that is clearly when you read Shakespeare, you get an enormous amount of psychological insight. But he wasn't a psychologist in the sense of systematically stepping back and trying to create a coherent psychological system. But good literature reveals to you psychological insight. And similarly, Kaviyachok, in a completely different vein, Chazal used Midrash and they used Rishonim used organic explanation to convey ideas, but they didn't step back and tell us exactly what they're doing, and we're left trying to piece this together. And in a few moments, I'll try and share that. I think we have some good clues as to how to do this. Yeah, sorry.
You say that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Reasonably possibly true, it's not mentioned. The Christian age, for example, one view is that it couldn't possibly have happened because it's such a great word, but it should have been.
Yes.
So we need to say that the Shel commentator is focused on Shel being a reality as opposed to an alternative dimension.
We don't know which way to jump. I mentioned the Christian age last time, which is the or custom is the translation, the furnace of the custom, or the city, or of the custom. Which reading is more reasonable? It depends what tools you use. This is the problem. It depends what tools you use for reasonableness. If the Torah were to be a modern work written by a known author, even if we couldn't speak to the author, but we know enough about modern authors' psychology, and we could say it'd be ridiculous for the author to hint to us a whole miracle like that. But with Torah, we don't know that much about the psychology of the author, because the author is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't have a range of texts to compare how God thinks books should be written. All we have is Masorah, and Masorah tells us what Chazal said. which is that it's reasonable for Hashem to tell us a hint at a whole story from one indication. I'm not aware of those that would disagree with that idea. We find the story of the furnace, if you're reading it from a non-Chazal mindset, you can say, how can it be that a big miracle is missed out from this? But if you don't see miracles as unusual, if you see, as the Ramban says, that miracles are only significant when they're predicted by a Novi, when they're clearly Yad Hashem, then you have a completely different. This is most explicit in the story, and I mentioned this also, the story of how old Yocheved was when she gave birth to Moshe. By some number crunching, she was extraordinarily old, and yet no fuss is made to this miracle. Says the Rambam, because the Torah doesn't make fuss about miracles on many occasions. There's only a certain type of miracle, a predicted miracle by Novi, in which the Torah makes a fuss about. We don't really have the tools to weigh up these competing models, because as the Ramban says, we're in the hands of Chazal, who tell us what the history was. Yeah. No, the Ramban, not at all. There's no evidence at all. The Ramban may be saying, I'm grappling with reasonableness because this isn't my intuition, but what we need to do is learn Chazal's intuition and then understand that the Torah is a different sort of text to the one that the external reader might think. In other words, my intuition was that a text wouldn't forget to mention how old Yocheved is when Moshe was born, but Chazal have taught me that it's a different sort of text that doesn't bother mention miracles in that way. I don't see a way of giving weighting to which one is the historical event, one more than the other. On the contrary, the Ramban certainly is on the camp who seems to understand the message more. Yeah. So I replied to the Ramban because you mentioned the Ramban. The Ibn Ezra, we have I don't know any evidence either way. Where do you see the evidence from? Certainly when it comes to halacha, the Ibn Ezra doesn't say that. Maybe because he thinks halacha is different to storytelling. We spoke a bit about history last time and what exactly history means. I'm not aware of any evidence one way or another, so you can come to your own conclusion if you wish. But certainly in the Ramban that's not the case, and probably in the Rashbam that's not the case, because the Rashbam keeps on saying, Al-Tazis, don't move from the Midrash Chazal, don't move from the Peshat of Rashi, I'm just revealing another layer of explanation. So in the Rashbam it definitely doesn't appear to be the case, but I don't know. I was going to mention another example of history around the topic when we mentioned what exactly happened. Everyone can blank that out. Okay, so let's just try and I'd like to share, just in the time available, one example of where the Rashbam went very far with this, and then try and explore. I'll try and get to at least one example of how how Peshat and Midrash can work together. And what it would mean, why there might be significance and interest in learning Peshat, even when it contradicts a halachic matter, and how it can add nuance to a halacha. Okay, so the example I want to give, in which the Rashbam seems to go to an extreme, is one that I mentioned very briefly in the Shabbos HaGadol Rosh, but perhaps should have elaborated on more, is the matter of a technical reading very early in Sefer Bereshis, and a radical seeming conclusion that emerges from Passukim. So the Passukim have a refrain throughout the 6 days of creation: Vayerev, Vayiboker, Yom Echad, Vayerev, Yom Sheni, Vayerev, Yom Shlishi, etc. Now, traditionally, that phrase has been understood to mean there was evening, there was morning, and with the conclusion of that time period, the first day was finished. So when we read, for example, Hashem said, Yi'er, let there be light, that is an event that takes place on the first day. Vayerev Vayivoka means there was evening free to that instruction of Hashem. There was morning. And then all the events just described have occurred. And with this, Yom Echad, the first day has finished. Hashem says, Yi'er Kiyah, Madzel B'Mayim L'Mayim, etc., etc. Vayerev Vayivoka, Yom Sheni, means all of this took place after there had been an evening and a morning and the day of the second day, and with that concludes the second day. Now, in this model, the day Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, starts with Erev, and finish it and continues through the hours of daylight. In other words, in line with our halachic understanding of what makes a day, which is that the day starts at night and then you have the day that follows. So we have an explicit pasuk which seems to indicate that Erev, night, precedes day in the way we calculate timings. Now this is very important because of course there's one particular event that occurs at the ends of the 6 days of creation, which is Vaychulu, followed by Shabbos. So when does Shabbos start? Shabbos starts after the conclusion of Yom Shishi, Vayerev, Vayiboka, Yom HaShishi. The 6th day has finished with having had an evening and a day, finishing Yom HaShishi, finishing Friday, now leading into Shabbos. Now, the Rashbam in his commentary points out that this isn't such a simple reading of the Passukim on numerous levels, including that if you want to say there was night followed by day, you wouldn't necessarily talk about Boker, you would talk about Yom, you would talk about the daylight hours. Also, this Vayihi Vayivoker is effectively going back to the beginning of the period. It should say Vayihi Vayivoker, there was evening, then there was day, then Hashem gave and did everything he did during that day, and with that we conclude that day of the week. But here it seems to say, after it's told us everything that happens, it then says Vayihi Vayivoker. So the Rashbam says there's an alternative translation, which I think reads better. Were it to be the way we've understood it, should say Vayihi Laila, Vayihi Yom. There was night followed by day. That's the normal terminology used. Once it's Vayihi Erev, Vayivoker, there's evening and there's morning. The evening doesn't sound like night. Evening sounds like approaching night. So Rashbam says that the correct translation is, it's described to us the events of the day. Then it says Vayihi Erev, evening comes, the sun begins setting. Vayihi Boker, morning begins coming. In other words, the beginning of the glimmers of light appears, which is what we call Alois HaShachar, the start of the morning. And with that concludes the day. In other words, the correct way of understanding the flow of time is that you have day followed by night, and with the beginning of Alois HaShachar, with the first glimmers of lights appearing, that's the conclusion of the previous day. In other words, a model in which night follows day. So says the Rashbam in Peshuto Shel Mikra. Now, I'm not sitting here trying to convince anyone of the simplest reading of the Passukim. My purpose here is not to take sides in how to read the Passukim, nor is it to justify the explanation of Rashbam, which comes with its own Peshat challenges. But if you were to assume that Peshuto Shel Mikra is the criteria of halacha, this Rashbam would be profoundly problematic because it would rewrite the whole halachic flow of time and the nature of the start of Yom Tovim and Shabbosos and the like. It'd be very, very problematic. Now, need we be worried about that? Maybe the Rashbam really held up Peshatus Kaveh things, and this is the really halachic determinant. We know that's not the case, because we know that the Rashbam was profoundly committed to halacha. He dedicated a significant, if not the most significant part of his life to explanation of the Gemara. He's one of the foremost. He's no closet Karaite or anything of the sort. We know exactly what he was doing. He was there, one of the Bali Tosfos. He's not an unknown figure. We know an enormous amount about him. We have vast amounts of halachic literature from him. He is the Rebbe of the next generation of Bali Tosfos. No one suggests that the Rashbam here in any way is Chas v'Shalom rewriting halacha whatsoever. Now, there's a fascinating letter from the Ibn Ezra, an Igeris called Igeris HaShabbos. The Ibn Ezra, as we know, was a commentator on the Torah. He was a poet. He was a polemist. Polemicist. Yeah, he wrote polemics. He engaged in battle against the Karaites and others with whom he disagreed. He had a terribly difficult life in which he was poverty-stricken. He had a sense of humor. He wrote riddles. He wrote wryly about himself that were he to go into the candle-making industry, the sun would never set. Were he to go into undertaking, people would cease to die. He had terrible financial problems throughout his life. He was perhaps the son-in-law or mechutan of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the famous author of the Kuzari and the Python. Very, very interesting individual. And he was a traveler, probably for financial reasons. Tragically, it's an amazing thing that one of the most remarkable, he's an astronomer, by the way, I should have mentioned also. He has a crater named after him on the moon. He was an astrologer. He believed in astrology also. And when he traveled Europe. Possibly he was literally a tramp of sorts, never a tragic life, one of the most dazzling minds in history, and possibly was literally walking from community to community begging, a really, really difficult life. He played quite an important role in bringing the Torah of Italy and Spain to Europe and bringing the Torah of the Europeans back to, because of his travels. And in winter of the year 4919, he is here in England. So Ibn Ezra came to visit England, and we know that he was there in England at the time because he wrote a letter which he dates Yud Dalad Teves, 4919, and he says, "I'm here in the corner of the earth." Angleterre, the angle is a corner, quite literally. The angles who the Celts and the Saxons are under the angles. The angles are so called because they came from an area in Denmark which was jutting out, quite literally, Ezra sticking out into the sea, which was known as an angle, corner, and Angleterre is the corners of the earth. And he says, I was there in Angleterre, and I had a nightmare. And again, it's difficult to know whether this is a sort of literary device or the like. And he says, I had a dream in which Shabbos appeared to me, almost like a personification. And Shabbos said to me, how can you be allowing your Talmidim to learn heterodox, non-orthodox books and have these Sephorim lying around? And he says, I woke up in a sweat. What's going on over here? Shabbos says, you're abusing me. What a terrible nightmare to have. And I am hunting through the Sephorim, and I found a commentator on the Torah who said that Shabbos starts in the morning and finishes with the next morning. Now, we don't know which commentator he's referring to. Were there others who also said this? We don't know. Is he hinting at the Rashbam, who we do know said this? But the Ibn Ezra then writes this Igeres in which he engages in polemics, and he says this is Peshat taken too far. This is Peshat that can ruin the whole of Yiddishkeit. If you begin saying things like this, where's it going to end? Chas v'shalom to make such a suggestion that the halachic day starts at morning and finishes with the approach of the next morning. This is outrageous. So here we have a machlokas between the Ibn Ezra and perhaps the Rashbam, if the Rashbam is the figure is referring to, or someone else, but certainly something akin to the Rashbam, in which the Rashbam says no, it's legitimate to say Peshatim, which contradict radically very basic halacha, and nonetheless there's value to this as Peshuto Shel Mikra. And then Ibn Ezra says there's no point in saying something which has no nuance to it, which can't possibly be explained. In other words, I mean, Ibn Ezra doesn't tell us his philosophy. Why does he think it's okay to say that Nimrod is a tzaddik and it's not okay to say this about Shabbos? What's his vision of the true history? Is it because he distinguishes between history and narrative versus halacha? Or is it because he recognizes that sometimes nuance is possible and there's value to the multiple levels and other times there isn't? We don't know. What could you say about this Rashbam? Why would this be relevant, this Rashbam? Well, there are interesting suggestions in halachic literature that even though the day follows the night generally in halacha, there is still legitimacy in recognizing that there's a natural day which follows a different cycle. By the way, in halacha, in kodshim, the night follows the day. So when it comes to a day, for example, you can eat korbanos for a day, the night follows the day. But that is not necessarily related to this. This is because of how the Passukim structure the halachas of Nosa and the functioning of the Beis HaMikdash. But would there be relevance in recognizing that there's a natural phenomena that underlies a tweak that the Torah makes to it? Let me use an example of this. The Rambam in the Laws of Marriage says the following. He says, marriage is a human institution that existed long before the giving of the Torah. Humans made commitments to each other to engage in monogamous, or at least from the females, monogamous relationships. And these are commitments that have halachic value and halachic reality to them. For example, a ben Noach who enters into such a commitment and then breaks the commitment is adulterous. and the halacha is that one of the Sheva mitzvahs in Noach is not to engage in adultery, don't ask when you learn the Sheva mitzvahs in Noach, 1 minute, they didn't do a Kedushin with Eidim and with a Hariyat Mekudeshesli and with Chuppah, because that's halachic nonsense. There is a commitment that can be made between two humans of marriage before, in a more fundamental level than halacha. Let me try and just explain what I mean. Even in a sense, even before halacha, one has to question what is the nature of reality. For example, is it obvious that people can own things? Is ownership just a convention that we've agreed amongst ourselves? Maybe it's just convenient because rich people who are more powerful like owning things and they don't want poor people to take things from them. Or is there really a relationship possible between humans and physical objects? Even in a proto-halachic world, in a world pre-Matan Torah, we still need to question what are the ethical and moral and spiritual realities that can exist. Not everything that we can choose to engage in can have halachic force. Forgive the example, but whilst pre-Matan Torah, humans can agree to a connection between the Isha in order to create marriage, which will have the halachas of adultery to it, a human can't agree to enter into such a relationship between themselves and an object, or themselves and an animal. There isn't the possibility of creating such a partnership. It's not a mechanism that exists. So the Torah, even pre-Matan Torah, we still have to ponder what exists and what doesn't exist. I'll give another example of this. There's a piece from Rabbi Brisker in which he analyzes the machlokas Rishonim as to whether tefillah is a mitzvah or not. And he points out simply that even according to the Rishonim, that tefillah is not a mitzvah, there is still what he calls a chefta of tefillah, a conceptual object called tefillah. In other words, it is a meaningful human engagement to speak to God, to address requests for Hashem. The concept of tefillah exists, whether tefillah happens or happens not to be a mitzvah. In other words, even in a sense, a sort of halachic determination whether there's an obligation to daven or when there's an obligation to daven, but the concept of tefillah exists. This isn't obvious. Who says there's anything meaningful in humans engaging in conversation and requesting of Hashem? Who says that such a concept exists? Who says there is a verb called to daven, to pray, litbalel? In other words, who says that conceptually this makes sense? Avraham simply points out that don't get mixed up and think that those who think that tefillah is not an obligation don't think there's an objective engagement entity, a chefta called tefillah, because we know there is such a chefta, because there's Passukim about it. Yitzchak davens for a child, Avraham davens for Sodom, this week's Ezra that we just learned, Moshe davens for the healing of his sister Miriam. Even if there's no mitzvah tefillah, but there's a chefta tefillah. So the Rambam is saying there is a chefta called marriage, which operates on its own rules in a pre-Matan Torah world, and perhaps even post-Matan Torah for Bnei Noach, and maybe even post-Matan Torah for Jews on some level or other. In other words, even if there's no halachic Jewish marriage of Kedushin and Neidos, maybe nonetheless there's some halachic significance to proto-marriage, which is something that existed without the giving of the Torah, but was a human engagement and human achievement. Now, can humans define days for themselves? Is there meaningfulness in a determinant of the passage of time? I mean, humans have to observe the passage of time. The Pasuk says that what was given to us to determine time, the sun and the stars, that determines the passage of the seasons, and also seemingly the passage of days. Is there a proto-day that sort of precedes halacha? And halacha is tweaking how that proto-day works. In the same way as halacha takes a pre-existing concept called marriage and says, yes, but for the Jews, there's a very specific way in halacha of how marriage should be entered into, in which there's fundamentally, if you like, a covenant of marriage that underlies and exists pre the giving of halachas, but then the Torah says there's a specific way in halacha this relationship should be entered to if we want it to have halachic legitimacy, which is the giving of an item of value or other forms of making kedushin, harem kedushin, with Eidim, and the like. So there's something, a reality that underlies pre-existing, like tefillah. There's a reality of conversing to God that Jew, non-Jew, any human being can engage in as a reality. And then halacha sets up particular halachas of tefillah as to how tefillah should be engaged in and when there's an obligation to so do. So the same with Yom, there may well be an underlying natural phenomena of the passage of time, which can be defined either as per this pasuk or as per human convention, which is a proto-halachic reality. And the Torah simply tweaks how that passage of time is defined by the halachas of day and night. And I just want to share that this may well have practical halachic implication. It is well known that a non-Jew is not allowed in halacha to keep Shabbos. Goyisha Shabbos, a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos. Shabbos is the gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to to Klal Yisrael, Yismach Moshe Matnas Chelko, a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos, and this has particular ink spilt over it in the context of the Geirus process. Whilst the Ger is practicing keeping Shabbos, how should they do? So there are important Passukim that believe that a non-Jew is allowed to keep Shabbos from Friday night to Motzi Shabbos, because even though in Halacha that is the day of Shabbos, but in a pre-halachic world, which is the world that the Ger is inhabiting, in which they're not entered into the Torah's definitions of things, the halachic day of Shabbos is Saturday, in which it starts midnight to midnight, or maybe morning till the next morning, and therefore the prohibition of Goy Shabbos, of defining their own Sabbath day, has to be in line with the more fundamental underlying reality of how the passage of time works, either as defined by Bereshis, as per the Rashbam, or as defined by society, because this is a raw concept that the non-Jewish world also has ownership of. There's a proto-halacha, like marriage, in which the non-Jewish world can determine its basis of property, or its basis of relationships, or its basis of marriage, and even its basis of the passage of time. So just because the Torah gives a Torah definition of the halachic day or halachic marriage, doesn't mean there's no relevance to a more raw, basic underlying definition, which, as I said, might be the defining feature, for example, of when the halacha of Goy Shabbos applies, because the halacha of Goy Shabbos is by definition a halacha that applies to someone who hasn't yet entered into the Sinai covenant.
One thinks about the issue. If from this week's parsha about the windows of the Beis Hamikdash and the menorah, Hakadosh Baruch Hu doesn't need our light, because Hakadosh Baruch Hu, there is no difference between day and night. The whole thing is there is no day and night. Hakadosh Baruch Hu, it's the way He's defined it. For us, it would seem that way, because everything's light for Hakadosh Baruch Hu. He hasn't got a night. He hasn't got a day. But
the idea you're showing is definitely related to this, as to what it means to be a human existing in the presence of Hashem. And what you're saying is correct. All I'm pointing out here, though, is another layer to that, which is it's possible there's multiple tiers to this, in which halacha has a halachic structure Torah defines for those who are within the relationship that Torah has created, and underlying that there's a more raw, perhaps human or perhaps B'nai Noach generated set of halachas.
And it helps, doesn't it, with the paying a non-Jew working on Shabbos if they're working Saturday night?
No, there it doesn't, because that's us paying someone to do a malacha on our Shabbos. And therefore it depends on our definition of Shabbos. Yeah, there's a very, I don't want to fall into the same trap as Ibn Ezra perhaps accused the Rashbam of doing this. There's very, very sensitive halachic application of this, but it's only something which is purely from within, according to some posting, from within the non-Jews' own world of operation. That isn't in and of in itself a Jewish halacha whatsoever. Yeah, sorry.
Issue two legal systems. Shabbat is a definition. You send down, that's what Shabbat is. You send down the sun said, don't do work. That's Shabbat. That's what Shabbat is. So when you take that and put to a legal system, you're losing part of the definition, because Shabbat is don't do these things at this time.
Your point is very astute, and many poskim would agree with you, and they say this doesn't make sense. Shabbos is our concept; it's a Jewish concept, and therefore it can only be defined by halacha. But the alternative approach is Shabbos is our concept, but a Goy Shabbos, a non-Jew who is keeping their own Shabbos, is the problem over here, and their own passage of time is as determined by a non-Jewish system. I'll give one other example of this, and all these examples are controversial, not in the sense of philosophically controversial, but in practical halacha. There's a lot of, I don't want to go too much into this because it opens its own very complicated area, but the definition of life and death is not a scientific, there is no scientific determination of life and death. It's purely a legal or halachic or philosophical or metaphysical issue. Meaning to say that as a human is born, it begins being created, bit by bit, pieces of existence emerge. And as a human dies, bit by bit, pieces of existence are removed. The analogy I use is, imagine a palace with 300 rooms in it. And one by one, the lights go on in the palace, and one by one, the lights go off. That's what the process of coming to existence is, and that's what the process of death is. The process of being born is, bit by bit, the fetus is constructed, and they develop lungs and kidneys and limbs and brain function and so on. But throughout the 9 months, even though they've got all of that, they don't have their own independent circulatory system until they emerge and they're born, and then that's detached now. So pieces come into existence. Similarly, when it comes to death, bit by bit, the person dies. There's the brain can switch off, the heart can switch off, the lungs can switch off. It could be all of those are switched off, and there's still fingernail growth that's occurring. A cell at the end of the body may not yet know that at the other end of the body, the brain has died, right? It's bit by bit switched off. Now, science can tell us the information as to when each piece is switched off. It has nothing to say about which bits going on and off are the critical determinants of what defines when a person is alive or dead. All science can say is this bit comes on here, and this bit there, and this bit there, and then at the end of life, this bit goes off here, and this bit goes off there, and this bit goes off there. Can't tell us which is halachically relevant, which room or combination of rooms is the key ones to determine the coming into existence of life or the end of life. And this is why the question of life is not one that can be left to doctors. You are all aware that in many halachic areas, we bow to doctors' advice. Shouldn't a person eat on Yom Kippur? We first need to get the information from a doctor. Over here, we need the information from the doctor when each thing occurs, but whether it's halachically critical is a Torah question, or a legal question, or a philosophical question, or a moral question, or a metaphysical question. It's not a scientific question. So the lights go on. At what point is the palace alight? That may not be a meaningful question. Bit by bit, it becomes a light. There may not be something called balasma. Is it the throne room that determines that it's a light, or the audience chamber, or the king's private apartment that determines it being light, or the majority, the rove of the rooms? These aren't questions that make sense unless you explain what you mean with respect to what is it relevant that the palace is a light or dark. And it's the same here. With respect to human existence, at what point does a fetus become halachically alive? At what point does a person at the end of their life cease to be alive? And of course, this gets one drawn into the whole debate around brain death and cardiac death, respiratory death, and all the various other things. Now, these halachas are laws that are Breuer Shel, that the peak of world importance. These aren't small halachas because they determine the laws of murder and the laws of cessation of life and the laws of abortion and the laws of when we can switch machines off and the laws of organ donation. Sometimes they're not ones that can or should be dabbled in lightly. These are very, very serious halachic questions. If I don't switch off the machine, if I don't take an organ, I may be losing an opportunity to save a life. But if I do take it, I may be murdering a person who is alive still, al pi halacha, and by taking an organ. Now, I'm not going to go into that whole sugya. It's a very important sugya and a complicated one that really needs to be left to the device of the most senior Passukim. It's not a sort of it's not something where it's important enough that needs proper resolution in complicated halachic matters. But there are Passukim that suggest that non-Jews are entitled to give their own definitions of life and death. So even with life and death, there may be a raw proto-reality that lies behind how the Torah defines it. So a non-Jew, like a Jew, is not entitled to murder, God forbid, not allowed to abort unless there's necessary conditions, as they're doing, because this is termination of life. But how do we define life? What is the point at which life starts and life starts? Well, Torah gives answers to these questions, which is when we learn the sugyas of, as I said, cardiac death and brain death and the like. But in the halachas of a ben noach, maybe they can determine their own criteria for life. In the same way, as according to some Rishonim, one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei is din. They should establish a legal system. Doesn't mean they need to use our legal system. They have to learn Pashas Mishpatim and Pashas Shotim, Baba Kama, Baba Mitzia, Baba Basra. Some Rishonim say yes, but many don't. Many think they can set up, as long as this is a reasonable legal system, then that's fine. It has to have the basic, that there are criteria to what's considered a reasonable legal system. It has to be fair, it has to be equitable, and so on and so on. But within those criteria, any functioning legal system that ensures justice is sufficient. Can we then even extend that much more controversially to even what defines life? Is a legal system allowed to adopt its own definition of life? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not giving a psak here. I just said this is not a psak to engage in casually. But even in that area, maybe there's a raw proto-reality, and law simply sets parameters to that. So Torah, halacha, sets the parameters relevant to our legal system, to our metaphysics, to Nishmas Yisrael, however one wants to define these things. But it doesn't mean there's no proto-reality behind that, of marriage, of tefillah, of even the passage of time, day and night, and maybe even of life and death. Maybe these are things which have an existence, in a sense, pre the halachic system, and halacha simply comes to determine what for us is the appropriate way to view these things. And therefore maybe this is what the Rashbam is engaging in when he says there's a Peshuto shel Mikra and a Midrashic layer of meaning. So next week we'll look at many more examples of this, which we'll look at more casually or superficially, because I just want to whiz through a series of other examples rather than getting caught up in the halachos of each one. But I hope that gives you a taste of where the Rashbam, where the Midrash versus Peshat might be going.
Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you.